Hey y'all, welcome back for another WSQ. Today we're going to be looking at the presidencies of Kennedy, Johnson, and also looking at the counterculture movement following the Vietnam War. As you're watching the video, make sure that you're answering the guided questions that are provided. It's okay if you have to pause or rewatch the video in order to answer these questions. When the video ends, make sure that you summarize the main points of the video using the paragraph form. Make sure that you use the specific vocabulary that are going to appear on your WSQ sheet. These are going to be bolded and underlined words during the video. Then finish by asking one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question to bring to class. The essential question that we're going to cover in this video is how did new movements for civil rights and liberal efforts expand the role of government and generate a range of cultural and political responses? Smart historians will analyze relationships among different social, ethnic, and racial groups and how these groups sought to change American society and institutions. Now, when President Kennedy became president, he was one of the most fabulous presidents we've ever had because he was the first one to appear on the television. During this election, Kennedy emphasized the new frontier, talking about the frontiers of the mind, the will, the spirit of man. He was also a Catholic and was the first Catholic to ever be president. He was also very popular with the American people, especially African Americans. When Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Georgia during a protest, Kennedy personally called Coretta and helped to get him released from jail. He's also the youngest president until Obama to be elected, and he wanted to focus mainly on change for America, and he also had a very young cabinet to advise him. Kennedy's plan to reform America became known as the New Frontier. Much of America was not really reform-minded in the 1960s. He's pretty popular with the American public, but he's not really all that popular with Congress, which is going to make it challenging for him to get many of his initiatives passed. It did help him solve problems outside of Congress, though. He's able to get a few initiatives passed, like the Area Redevelopment Act and the Minimum Wage Act, that would also help poor Americans. The program that came to symbolize his new frontier, with the new frontier of the mind and new frontier that they were focusing on, was the space program. The new frontier, since Americans had taken over the entire frontier of the United States and we had already taken on the frontier of the world, now obviously we had to expand past Earth into space. The Soviet Union was already ahead of Americans in the space race. They had launched their first satellite, the Sputnik, and they also launched a human into space. And so Kennedy was determined to send a man to the moon to advance the Americans above the Soviets during the space race. By 1969, Neil Armstrong would be the first man to walk on the moon. The space race was just as much a part of the Cold War as the arms race and the containment of communism. Earl Warren, during the time of Kennedy's presidency, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was responsible for a lot of major rulings during Kennedy's presidency. At about the mid-1900s, state legislatures had not really redrawn the boundaries of their districts to reflect their population. The Supreme Court ruled in Baker v. Carr that this situation denied urban voters equal protection under the law, and it required that these redistricts be redrawn so that everyone has an equal vote. Now they're required to be redrawn every 10 years with the census. The Warren Court also extended the Bill of Rights, the actions of state government. Mapp v. Ohio was one of the most important of these, and it established that there must be a search warrant required in any sort of situation with state or local police. Gideon v. Wainwright established that the state must provide lawyers to poor persons being tried for crimes. Miranda v. Arizona established that when making an arrest, they must read you your Miranda rights. Engel v. Vattel also outlawed prayer in schools. While campaigning in Texas, Kennedy was shot and killed. President Johnson was immediately sworn in aboard Air Force One. If you look in the picture on the right, you can see Johnson being sworn in, but the person standing next to him is none other than Kennedy's wife. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the shooting of President Kennedy. However, there were some questions about what had happened with the assassination. President Johnson formed a commission that was headed by Justice Earl Warren that he called the Warren Commission, trying to investigate the assassination. There was this whole conspiracy theory that Oswald hadn't acted alone, but the commission came to the conclusion that he did act alone and he was the only one arrested. When Johnson became president, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that Kennedy and Johnson were pretty opposites. Also, appearance-wise, Johnson was really intimidating and large, and Kennedy was handsome and small. Kennedy had appeared to the American public because he'd been really good-looking. Johnson was crude, large, and sometimes could be intimidating, exactly shown in the picture on the right. When he lived in Texas, Johnson had taught public school and gave up his career for politics during the Great Depression. But his legacy of school teaching stayed with him and allowed him to see poverty firsthand, giving an influence to many of his policies. He wanted to extend the role of government to help make people's lives better. Johnson reassured the nation that in Kennedy's passing that he would continue on with some of Kennedy's programs included in the New Frontier. Kennedy's interest in anti-poverty programs had been influenced by a book called The Other America that countered the idea that every American had benefited from post-war prosperity. There was a whole other America that was being denied the prosperity and the money that was coming out of the end of World War II. In his first State of the Union address, Johnson declared a war on poverty, saying that he was going to address many of the issues that many Americans were facing. He asked Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act that they did pass in August of 1964. The Economic Opportunity Act would result in a lot of the Great Society programs. He said that there is work to be done. We are on our way to the Great Society. Due to the Great Society, his interest in education, Johnson's Great Society programs had a lot to do with education. The Economic Opportunity Act supplied for a program called Head Start that would allow preschool children of low-income parents to get a head start in education before starting kindergarten. Kindergarten was the last grade that was allowed during public school. The Omnibus Housing Act also provided housing for low-income Americans, and it created the Department of Housing and Urban Development that was headed by Robert Weaver. In July of 1965, Congress also authorized funds for states to set up Medicaid that would provide free medical care for poor people. It also added in Medicare for people over the age of 65. During the peak years of the Great Society, Congress passed 181 of the 200 programs that were proposed. But many Americans started to get concerned about how much money we were spending, what we were spending it on, and how quickly we were reforming and how much we were expanding the role of government. Some programs, such as the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, were also passed during this time period. That's what establishes PBS that a lot of you guys watched Arthur on when you were kids, and also NPR, the National Public Radio. Another one of the factors in the decline of the Great Society was our increasing involvement in the Vietnam War. At this point in Johnson's presidency, the Vietnam War was taking a lot more of his control and a lot more of his focus. About 385,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam, and we were spending about $2.5 billion every single month just on the war alone. There was a lot of pressure on the government to attempt to pay for the programs and also the war. Johnson ultimately chose to fund the war over the domestic programs, thinking that the containment policy was way more important. He also declared that intervention was justified because he wanted to prevent the spread of communism in Latin America. This became known as the Johnson Doctrine. He also sought to improve some of the relations with the Soviet Union and try to work with the Soviet Union to improve worldwide conflicts. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the United States had spent over $150 billion fighting the war. A lot of Americans were really angry at the government at this point, because they felt like they'd been misled. To prevent another Vietnam War, Congress passed the War Powers Act that set a 60-day limit on presidential commitment of U.S. troops without authorization from Congress. In 1982, the Vietnam War Memorial was unveiled, listing all 58,000 Americans who were killed or listed as missing in action during the war. The U.S. doesn't resume relations with Vietnam until 1995. Out of the Vietnam rose the counterculture movement. The counterculture movement was a rebellion of teens and young adults, approximately like 15 until 25, that were against mainstream American society. They thought these American values that was in mainstream were hollow and misplaced. They wanted to turn their back on the establishment. They blamed their parents for all the societal problems, for Vietnam, for racism, for nuclear war, for pollution. And there was a large number of these youth because of the baby boom after World War II. College students were some of the main people whose voices were heard during the counterculture movement. They started protesting any sort of policies that they thought might be unjust. At the University of California, Berkeley, there was a big protest on freedom of speech and also demonstrations. They called their movement the Free Speech Movement. And they spread throughout the United States, advocating for college-age students to pronounce their different beliefs. Thousands of teens and young adults, when they abandoned mainstream culture, became what they called hippies. Some formed in communes that became the center of their hippie culture. They majorly valued peace and love, man, and they shared everything of what they had. They had a reputation for drug use as well, especially LSD. They wore colorful clothing like tie-dye, and sometimes they were referred to as flower children. The height of the hippie movement centered around Woodstock, or the Summer of Love festival. Movement declined eventually because too many people were doing drugs. There was also a lack of parent support as the parents realized what their kids were doing. The baby boom generation had a little bit more traditional values, while the hippie culture was the opposite. Many of these mainstream Americans viewed hippies as disrespectful, uncivilized, and threatening to American culture. They thought it was a sign that America might be losing its sense of what is right and what is wrong. TV shows like All in the Family highlighted the conflict between the hippies and mainstream culture. In the pictures below, you see the Woodstock concert on the left and hippies on the far right. As America became more permissive and casual during the 1950s, sexual activity and violence on television became more prevalent. Pop art also was becoming a little bit more sexualized, and they had to create a rating system for movies during this time period because there were so many things that they didn't think children should be seeing. Music during this time period also became a lot more political, with artists like Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and Joan Baez writing songs that focused on a criticism of the government, but also on society. As you watch the video, make sure you're answering the guided questions. It's okay if you had to pause or if you need to rewatch the video now in order to answer those guided questions. When the video ends, go ahead and summarize the main points of the video in paragraph form, making sure that you use the specific vocabulary given to you on the WSQ sheet. These are going to appear as bold and underlined words during the video. Then finish by asking one question, something you're still confused about, a general question, or a discussion question for the class. Thanks for joining me for this WSQ, and I'll see you in class.